In this video we're going to modify the pawn's speed, create an inventory item that will allow the pawn to move faster upon touching it. It's kind of like sort of like a Pac-Man-ish type thing when the Pac-Man would go over the special dot that gave him superpowers. It's kind of the same thing. So what's going to happen here is first we're going to set the pawn's initial ground speed. We're gonna modify it to make it go a little slower than what it normally is. So we're gonna set ground speed equals 220. You can set this to something you want that you want if you think 220 is a little too slow. You're more than welcome to set it whatever you want. And also in default properties, we're going to set B can pick up inventory equals true. This will set all pawns with the ability to pick up inventory at this point. Something we may not want, but we will be probably changing that later. So for now though, we'll set it to B can pick up inventory so we can go through the rest of this video and you can see how it works. Now inside of our player controller, we have a few functions that we're going to be going into as well. But for right now, we're going to hold off on this and we're going to come back to it because before we can even get into these functions, we're going to want to create these inventory items. So first, we're going to create a base inventory called puz inventory, and it's going to extend off of inventory, so it'll be a puz inventory.uc file. This is the base file, and what that basically means is you're going to, in case if you had certain code that you wanted to work with all inventory items that you were creating, you may want to put it in here so you don't have to recreate it over and over again. Though we're not putting anything in here right now, we may actually later move stuff from back and forth and move stuff around and add stuff. So, but for right now, it's nice to have that class created. Then we're also going to create what's known as puz inventory underscore speed up oil can, and that's going to extend puz inventory. Now this is the actual inventory item that would be spawned into the inventory of the player upon touching this pickup factory. So once again, this is puz inventory underscore speed pickup oil can.uc. Now in case if you're wondering why is it so long, well, you won't probably have to spell this out too much. And also, by doing puz inventory and puz inventory underscore, when you go into your list of classes, they kind of stick together. So it's a lot easier to find them together if you do something like that. As opposed to naming it puz speed up oil can, then all of a sudden now you're searching when you start to have a lot of classes, you start searching, wondering where that class is. Next, we're going to create a class called puz pickup factory, and it extends from U to K pickup factory, and we're going to set that to an abstract. So if you notice, the semicolon's not at this end here; it's actually at the here, and it's an abstract for its specifier. Now, what that means is that this class doesn't really have a concrete value; it won't exist in the game. It's an abstract class. It's more just kind of like a middleman at this point. It's just a bunch of code to kind of continue on forward. We could kind of do the same thing with this if we wanted to. It's not super necessary to actually put in abstract. It's not something like if you have to put it in, it's not like the end of the world. It's just it ensures that that this class won't be used for what it's not meant for. Then we're going to create another class, and this one is called the puz pickup factory underscore speedup. Once again, we're using the puz pickup factory, and then we're just throwing an underscore in, and then we'll just call it speed up. If you want to, you can call this the speed up oil can if you want to keep it going. I just kind of kept it a little shorter just because of the fact that we're already kind of extending it out pretty far. Now, in this class, it's going to extend puz pickup factory, just as this one extended from U to K pickup factory. And this one's going to be placeable. Now, technically, you don't really have to put placeable in this case because the pickup factory, the original one, already has placeable in. But I'm going to throw it in there anyway just for the purpose of showing you how this works. By using a placeable specifier, you're basically saying that when you start the engine up and you're running the editor and you're creating your map, you're allowing the person making the map to place this into their map wherever they want by just selecting it and then right-clicking wherever they want it and placing that actor there. So it allows it to be placed in the map. If it wasn't placeable, the only other way it could come into the game would be through spawning through code or some variation of that, or maybe through another placeable object. Inside this class, we're going to have a dynamic light environment component. We'll call that iLight. What a dynamic light environment component is exactly what kind of like a skeletal mesh component, except it's a light environment, so it's going to create light for this item. Um, if you don't have a light environment on your objects, what happens is if it's in a dark area, the darkness pretty much overwhelms it and takes it over. You won't be able to see it. If it's lit up like a Christmas tree, it doesn't matter if you have a light environment or not because it doesn't need one. So the positive to doing this is that if it's in a dark environment, it'll still show up to the player. It won't be hidden from in darkness. The downside is if you're trying to do some sort of realistic thing by having a light environment on an object, it's going to be easily seen by the player. They don't have to kind of flash a flashlight on it or something like that. So if you wanted to create like a really dark room and you don't want them to see the items in there, you probably wouldn't want to put a light environment on the objects of the class that you have in there. You'd want them to actually have to shine the light themselves or do something to create light. Okay, so the first function that we're actually the only function we're going to um, overwrite is give_to. This function actually exists in the pickup factory, and it's kind of the function that, like, after the person picks it up and touches it, at that point, it's giving the item to the pawn. There's a few things that happen in it, and if you want to, you're more than welcome to go back and take a look at the original function. We're actually going to just completely overwrite it. We're not even going to use any of the previous code, so we won't be using a super keyword or anything like that. So we have local puz player controller puz PC. Puz PC is going to equal puz player controller p.controller, and then if puz PC is not equal to none, and then we're going to do some more stuff. So what's happening here? Well, once again, we're creating a version of our player controller because that's what our player controller is now. It's a puz player controller. We set that back in the puz game, if you remember. Puz player or player controller class is equal to our puz player controller. So that means pretty much all players are going to use this puz player controller class. Now to go back, we're going to set p.controller. Well, the give_to, the pawn p that gets passed in, this parameter, the p, is already handled for us. So we know that that's the pawn that touched this pickup factory that's collecting it. And then what we're going to grab is the controller from it. And controller is a variable that exists inside of pawn. So, and it's set to what the controller is. So what we're doing is we're just setting that controller to our puz player controller, or we're typecasting it to make it equal our puz player controller. Since a controller is a parent of puz player controller, we can do that. Now, we're just going to make sure now if puz PC is not equal to none. So if this wasn't a player controller, if this was not a puz player controller, if it was a regular player controller, or if it was a even if it was an AI controller of some sort, then this would actually equal none because it would not all match. So because in this case though it will definitely match because all players are puz player controllers. There's no reason this won't be none unless a artificial intelligence bot of some sort touches the item and picks it up. And then at that case, it won't do anything. It'll probably not even pick it up, to be honest. Okay, so we have puzzpc.handleSpeedPickup, and then we're going to pass the class in, and basically puzzpc. So now we're grabbing this player controller, and we're going to go to code. And then, so we have handleSpeedPickup, which is a function we created inside of our puz player controller, and there it is, handleSpeedPickup. But we'll come back to that again in a second. Then we have picked up by, and then we pass the pawn in there. Now, the picked up by is another function that's already been created for us inside Pickup Factory. You're more than welcome to go back and look at that and see what happens with that. That basically gives the item the ability to respawn and also removes it from the map. So it kind of does a few things for us. If we took this out, the player could walk over the item and the item wouldn't disappear at all. Okay, so now we're going to look at this function here again, handleSpeedPickup. Now what we're passing in is class puz inventory. Once again though, we have an inventory type from back in down below here. We have what's known as an inventory type for each puz pickup factory. Every pickup factory has to have some sort of inventory item. If it doesn't have an inventory type associated with it, it doesn't spawn because it really serves no purpose. If you're trying to create an item that's supposed to spawn an item, and you don't know what that item you're supposed to spawn is, then the system's going to say, why am I wasting my time? I'm not going to bother spawning it. So the inventory type is basically this item that we're supposed to be creating, which is pointing back to our speed up oil can that we created earlier. Now going back to the top here, we go to the give to here, and we have the handle speed pickup. So what we're doing is, because inventory type, which is something that was created back in Pickup Factory, there was no such thing as puz inventory. So we kind of have to typecast the class in to tell it, when you transfer over to handle speed pickup, we want you to count it as a puz inventory item. So because inventory is a parent of puz inventory, and puz inventory is a parent of puz inventory underscore speed up oil can, we can do that. If there was no connection, this would return none and would actually probably give us some warnings. So we're going to go ahead and transfer or pass that through, and we're going to go look at handle speed pickup in a second. But just real quick, we're going to go down to default properties here and look at some of the stuff we have in here. So first, if you notice, we're removing components. Kind of like how we have components.add, there's also components.remove, and you use the name of the component in order to remove it. What we're removing is sprite2, an arrow, and then we're setting what's known as a good sprite and a bad sprite to none. Now all this stuff is involved with parent classes. Sprites were used to, they're like kind of like a 2D view if you don't know what a sprite is, and they're used to, in this case, to tell us if the sprite is too low to the ground or too high, or if it, which angle it's going to be spawned at, things like that. That's what the arrow was for. If you look at a player start, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It has like a little arrow that you can rotate around to tell, okay, is the player going to face this direction or that direction? In this case, we don't really need to worry about that because this item is kind of universal all around, and also this stuff just kind of gets in the way because the way we're going to actually spawn the pickup is using our own static mesh in the game. Alright, so after we remove all these old things from the parent class, we need to use that light that we created at the top here, this dynamic light environment. Right now it really is just an empty piece of memory. So we're going to go down here and we're going to create an object and we're going to add it to this pickup factory. So begin object class equals a dynamic light environment component, just as this is up here, dynamic light environment component. We're going to name itplight for puz light, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then we have bcast shadows equals false, bdynamic equals false. Now if you want this to cast a shadow, you're not going to want this to be false. Same thing with dynamic. If you want to cast some sort of dynamic light, you don't want this to be false. After that, we're going to say end object, just so we know we're not doing anything else here. We're going to set ilight to plight. So what that does is that allows us to use ilight anywhere in our code now in this class to modify the light environment. So if, for instance, if there's a certain situation where you want the light to act a little differently, that's how you would do it. Now we have also finally the most important part, components.add, and we're going to add this object to this class. If we didn't do this, then it really wouldn't do anything at all. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a static mesh component for the visual. Now this is going to obviously be two parts here. This is going to allow you to see the static mesh in the game and also in the editor. So first we're going to do is begin object class static mesh component, and we're going to set the name to an item pickup, and then we're going to have static mesh equals static mesh, and then where it's located inside the content, which is class content.staticmesh.oilCan inside the the editor. We're not going to cast shadows, and there's a few other things in here you're more than welcome to look at. Just the big two things here: always load on client, always load on server. That really is for multiplayer, but it's something you want to get used to using a lot of. You don't want to get used to not using it. So I just throw it in there for that purpose. And then, like I said, all these things you can just check out individually by going to the static mesh component, or maybe its parent class might have it as well. We set the light environment to the plight, kind of like what we're going to do with the skeletal mesh eventually for our pawn. We'll be setting a light environment for our pawn as well. Scale 3D allows you to scale it to a bigger size if you needed to. There's also scale, which is just one number, kind of does everything. Now also we're going to end the object, and then we're going to set pickup mesh, which is something that exists in the parent classes, and we're going to set that to the item pickup, so we can, if we needed to modify this for some reason, we could. And then we're going to add the component to we're going to add this to the class. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to change an object that's already associated with the pickup factory, which is its collision cylinder. To do that, we just do begin object like we're going to create an object, but instead of using a class, we're now just going to use the name of the previous one to say we're going to edit. And that's pretty much what we're doing. We're just changing the radius, the height, and we're going to set collide with actors to true. So the player will collide with the collision cylinder to enact the pickup. And then we're going to have end object. Notice how you do not have to have components.add this time because it's already been added. If it wasn't added though, you wouldn't want to do that. So that pretty much is all the code for the Puzz pickup factory. So what's gonna happen is when you touch it, it's gonna call on this function give2, and the give2 is gonna check to see if you are a player controller. If you are, it's gonna do this extra code. If you aren't, it's not gonna do really anything else at that point. So let's go ahead and head over to handle speed pickup and take a look at that. So we're in handle speed pickup. In the Puzz player controller. Now we need to create a bool called b speed pickup timer on. A boolean is basically a true and false, so it's either on or off, true or false. And then we have pawn.groundspeed equals 500. So as soon as the give2 function hits from the pickup factory, it's going to set our ground speed to 500. Now if we did no other code than just that, it would set it to 500 and it would never reverse back. So our guy would just always go faster. And if you want that kind of effect, you're more than welcome to do it. You may also notice that I set this kind of to a straight up number. You may not want to do that. You may want to do plus equals, where you're adding the original ground speed and then adding extra to it instead of setting it to a straight number, which is probably more the way to go if you really know what numbers you want to use. Because if you do that, if you wanted, let's say for instance, you wanted to increase it by 50%, you would probably multiply the original by 0.5 or 1.5. You could take the original and multiply it back into itself, but with a half. So what that would do is you would go from your 220 to a 330. In our case, since the default is 220. However, you can also use just straight up numbers if you feel comfortable that way too. It's just you have to remember, because you don't want, if you change, for instance, let's say later in your game you say 220 is too slow, let me increase it to 500. Well, now when he picks up the speed pickup, he's not going to be noticing any difference. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is after we increase the ground speed, we're going to do a check to see if what is known as a timer that we're going to be creating, which is what this boolean is associated with, is on. So we're going to say exclamation point b speed pickup timer on. And what that means is if that's false, by using that marker right there, that's saying if this is false. If you took that away, it's saying is it true. You could also, if you wanted to, do what's known as equal false. If you want to not use special symbols, and you could do that, and that would be the exact same thing as what we had before. Now the next underneath that we have set timer 10 false speed pickup timer. We'll get back to that in a second. And then what happens is if it is false and that we set that timer and we turn it on, we want to set this to true so it doesn't keep setting timers. We don't want it to continuously create timers every time someone picks up the speed pickup. The way this code is set up is once you pick up the speed pickup once, picking up another one doesn't do anything special. As a matter of fact, it won't even reset the time. It's just you want to make sure it wears out first before you do anything. So what's going to happen with the set timer function? What this is set timer creates a timer, and the third parameter is the name of the timer, okay? So, which is called speed pickup timer, which is the function we created right here. The first parameter is a number, which is how many seconds until the timer initiates this function. So the timer starts counting before it hits here. It's not like it's doing the reverse where it hits and then counts. Now, and then the second parameter is either true or false, and what that means is it's either going to loop or not loop. False means it won't loop, true means it will. If we set this to true, the timer will just continuously keep going until we do what's known as a clear timer, which would actually shut it off manually. This is just going to shut off on its own. Okay, so let's look at speed pickup timer. So we go down to speed pickup timer. After 10 seconds expires, this timer is going to kick in and turn this on and use this function one time. What we're going to do is we're going to set pawn.groundspeed to equal pawn.default.groundspeed. So what we're in essence doing is we're just resetting the ground speed back to what the default speed is supposed to be. And then we're going to set the b speed pickup timer to false, which will then allow the timer to come back on So in case if the player does pick up another uh, speed up, it will reenact at 10 seconds before it returns back to normal speed. And that pretty much does it for this video. So if you were to run this, and if you do notice, for instance, that there isn't any oil cans in the map, you would have to open up the editor and go into the map and place them through the in the content browser. You'll notice an actor area. You go to the actors, and then you find pickups. Open that up, and inside there you should see the pickup factory for speed up, and then just pop those wherever you want. And that, when you run the map, you may have to rebuild it, but when you run the map, when you pick these up, it should do everything it's supposed to.